Okay, little pop quiz here. We do this from time to time. I want to keep you guys on your toes out there. Um, this seems like a simple one, but it's a little more complex than it may appear at first level. But here we go. Go right into it. Is it America's vital national interest to make sure that we protect our interests worldwide? Should we, or put another way, should the United States form policies designed to benefit our country and to protect our way of life and to protect our economic freedom? Should we do that? Yes or no? Very simple question here. Doesn't require too much. Okay, obviously the answer should be yes. Obviously we should. It shouldn't even be a question. Naturally, that's what we should do. Why is it then that almost the opposite seems to be going on? Western recklessness, and by Western, I primarily mean the United States, but as you'll see in today's episode, not entirely just the U.S., something close to just insanity is going on in how we're conducting our affairs, especially as it relates to the Russia-Ukraine war, which is bad on its own right. But we're doing, it seems, everything in our power to jack this up and make it even worse. And I need some help to untangle all this mess today. So we're calling on a favorite of the show, Jason Beardsley, former Trump administration advisor, current the director of Veterans Initiatives at Stand Together, and a former combat vet himself. Can't think of anybody better, Jason. Thanks for coming on the show to help us out today.
Always great to be here with you, Colonel. And things get ever complex as the world turns.
Yeah, and you look, I get it, Jason. I mean, the world is complicated. It always has been. It's never been anything besides that. But at least I would say through at least much of our history, we've had wise statesmen, even some who were like cold-hearted sometimes, but would take actions that, like, even though I want this to happen, the basic analysis of the conditions say that we're not going to be able to get there. So instead, we're going to have to cut bait and go this direction here, even though we don't want to, but it's just what we have to. That has generally predominated, though it seems like in recent couple of decades, it's been starting to fray. But right now, it's like in free fall.
Well, there's a couple of factors at play. I think a president is typically going to look for a solid victory when they can achieve one, but when they can't achieve the solid on the ground type victory, it's also been important in the last 20, 30 years, as you're sort of pointing out, that the public relations victory, the PR, the sort of spin actually happens, or I'll call that a perception victory. If we say everything's great or everything's fine or on the up and up, oftentimes, that's enough for an audience to walk away having seen the seal of the White House or the Department of Defense and the calm demeanor of our statesmen and leaders saying, hey, things are good, or things are getting better, or the world is chaotic, but we're doing the best we can. Generally, that has been enough in the perception battle to kind of walk away with let's call it a modest type of portended victory. The problem is things are falling apart rapidly, as the old saying goes, slowly at first and then, quickly after all, or something like that. So I think that's where we are.
And, I think that as you bring that up, I mean, that brings to mind the most recent debacle, which graphically showed exactly that dynamic you just showed about a gradual deterioration and then a sudden collapse with our situation in Afghanistan. For 20 years, we kept having this fiction of the seal of the White House and the seal of the Department of Defense, the stars of all these generals and secretaries of whatever claiming, things are on the improvement. The Afghan government is, getting rid of corruption. The Afghan army is standing on their own. How many times do we hear that phrase? Until it literally collapsed in a few days in August of 2021 for very predictable reasons, because the reality on the ground never matched the rhetoric up there. We have a similar dynamic unfolding before our eyes right now in the Russia-Ukraine war situation. But this time, Jason, the stakes are much, much higher. Now, I would argue that the situation with Afghanistan, as bad as some of these images were, it was kind of a stain on our honor. But I mean, honestly, a few weeks after all of that finished up and everybody kind of shook their dust off their hands and moved on, everybody turned around and went on with whatever was next, because it didn't have any real implications and ramifications for our security at all. So it was easy to forget. This situation is starting to look really troubling, because it seems like our leaders across the West are trying to provide that same level of fiction and statements to try to eke out a information victory, not realizing that they're actually setting the stage for a potential catastrophic outcome this time that would affect us, unlike the last one. And in case anybody thinks I'm hyperbole here or making more of it than it is, let me show you a few things that are unfolding for us right now. Now, a few days back, Jens Stoltenberg, I believe it was on the 2-year anniversary of the war between Russia and Ukraine, came out and emphatically again repeated, yes, Ukraine will be in NATO. Even though about a year ago, he conceded and admitted that the war had begun because Putin said Ukraine in NATO. He had given NATO, apparently privately, that if you keep NATO out of Ukraine, if you'll declare neutrality, there won't be a war. But if you do, we're coming in. And Stoltenberg said, of course, we didn't agree to that. And so, of course, Putin made good on what he said. So now, 2 years later, Stoltenberg is again coming out and saying, yes, Ukraine and NATO. Now then, I think it was earlier today in Europe, French President Macron throws a little bit more fuel on the fire when he said this.
Macron said while no consensus was reached on deployment, France could not rule out a potential later need for it to ensure Russia does not win the war.
We should not exclude that there might be a need for security, which then justifies some elements of deployment. But I've told you very clearly what France maintains as its position, which is strategic ambiguity that I stand by. Nothing should be excluded to pursue our goals.
So he wants to say, yeah, you know what? Maybe we'll put a few French troops in there. And there's a couple of other nations that are talking about possibly even on a bilateral basis, not NATO per se, but they're, NATO troops from their country. We'll just throw a few troops in there and see how that works out. Now, I'm going to show you one other clip here in just a second. But before I do, I want to mention that in our show, I think it was yesterday, we showed Ben Hodges, who has been a strong advocate of giving Ukraine everything that they ever wanted, everything that we can do so that they can take Crimea. That's always been his thing. He says that's the center of gravity. We need to take Crimea. He thought they were going to have it last year. It didn't happen. Now, in light of what Macron just said, in light of what Hodges said just a couple of days ago, again reiterating Crimea, it's instructed to go back to what Vladimir Putin said 2 weeks before the war started, when this same Macron had gone to visit him in a last-ditch attempt to negotiate an end. You may remember this. It was quite famous at the time that because Macron went to Moscow itself to visit with Putin. Well, after that conversation, Putin had this to say. Now, as you listen to him, think about in light of what Hodges, Stoltenberg, and Macron have just said in the last few days.
Я хочу еще раз все-таки подчеркнуть это. Я говорил, но мне очень бы хотелось, чтобы вы меня услышали все-таки в конце концов. И донесли это до своих читателей, зрителей и пользователей в интернете. Но вы понимаете или нет, что если Украина будет в НАТО и военным путем будет возвращать себе Крым, европейские страны автоматически будут втянуты в военный конфликт с Россией. Конечно, потенциал объединенной организации НАТО и России несопоставим. Мы понимаем. Но мы также и понимаем, что Россия одна из ведущих ядерных держав. По некоторым компонентам, по современности даже многих опережает. Победителей не будет. И вы окажетесь втянутыми в этот конфликт помимо своей воли. И вы даже не успеете глазом моргнуть, когда будете исполнять пункт 5 Римского договора. Господин президент, конечно, не хочет этого развития. И я не хочу. И я не хочу. Поэтому здесь и находится.
Okay, so that dynamic still exists today. Russia is still the largest nuclear weapon state on the planet. No nuclear weapon state is going to allow its forces to be driven from the field. We certainly wouldn't. That's why we have a nuclear deterrent. Russia has the same nuclear deterrent. So why, tell me, Jason, are we pushing back up against this when it looks like, for all intents and purposes, Ukraine has past tense already lost a conventional war? Why would we want to make that worse by pushing a risk that it turns nuclear?
Yeah, this is a fascinating series of clips there. I mean, we used to have what statesmen referred to as the Great Game. You mentioned Afghanistan before, and that's where empires kind of spoiled their efforts and their energies on the plains of Afghanistan, which was not critical to their empires at the time, but was exhausting for resources and battlefields, and everybody lost in the plains of Afghanistan. So we entered what you might consider our little foray into the Great Game, and similarly had a retreat that was somewhat humiliating. And now what you see is the statesmen preparing to move that chessboard, that Great Game, onto the doorstep of Russia. And when whether it's Putin or whether it's Macron or Jan Stoltenberg talking about Crimea, what they're really threatening is a war of rhetoric, right? Because the hard truth is the cold facts on the ground will dictate what happens in a hot war, tanks on tanks, jets on jets. But that's not what's really at play here. What's really at play is the war we're already in with Russia, which is a war of the government, whole of government. So we're talking cyber, information, we're talking about threats to the economy or asymmetric warfare. That's the 21st century war battlefield. And really, it's a war of ideas and challenging regimes through the pernicious philosophies that undermine current regime powers. So now what you see is Russia is actually applying those rules of asymmetric warfare, whether it's in direct confrontation with the West or through proxies, as you and I have discussed over and over again, in places like Syria and Lebanon, or Hamas and Israel, or Houthis on the Red Sea. And so the engagement of war is already happening. The idea that Putin is going to threaten with nuclear war, that's kind of the old application of mutually assured destruction, the sort of thing that kept the West and the East from kind of going at it for the years of the Cold War. If you hit your buttons, we'll hit ours, and nobody's a winner. You heard him say that there. So meanwhile, this gives the statesman the illusion of being tough. Macron can get out there and say, yeah, maybe we'll send French troops. But if he really meant that, boy, that's a long journey. Don't forget that while they're talking in this sort of hot rhetoric, they're trading in oils, they're trading in revenue. Russia owns the kind of the pipeline to turn on for the Europeans in the winter. So this is a lot of gamesmanship. But what we see is the cold, hard facts on the ground will dictate.
And see, here's what worries me, though, is that if it was just rhetoric, you could roll your eyes and say, okay, yeah, whatever. But as we're going to see here in a few more clips in a minute, some of these things are more than just rhetoric. They're actually starting to turn into actions, which increases the chance of miscommunication, misunderstanding, or miscalculation. And when you're talking about the stakes as being as high as it is, that troubles me. Because here's what I got to try to figure out, Jason. What does Macron think that he's going to accomplish by this? He's trying to, use strategic ambiguity, which ironically is what underpins the U.S. and China in the war over the Taiwan. He wants to introduce it here while they're in a hot war, not in a war of rhetoric or anything else. But what does he think? Does he actually think that by saying that, hey, we might send French troops into Russia? Of course, Russia may say, how'd that work out last time? But that's a separate issue. But does he think that Putin's going to go, oh, damn, I didn't think about that. All right, boys, pack it up. Let's head back. What does Macron think he's going to accomplish?
First of all, you're very right to point this out. This is a significant posture stance when he uses the term strategic ambiguity. As you pointed out, that's an application of a different policy we're using in Indochina and the Pacific to kind of keep China at bay. And the idea that we might instigate that or instantiate that while we're in the middle of this kind of simmering war between Ukraine and Russia is frankly ludicrous. I don't think the Russians take it that seriously. But what it does, to your point, is it threatens the mishappenstance, what might happen should an incident, spill over or an airliner becomes downed, or God forbid, some missile strays into a third country or a NATO country. So the point is, using this rhetoric, as you point out rightly, is not just about words. It threatens action. So here comes Macron, here comes the West. You heard Jan Stoltenberg portraying this idea that NATO is not going anywhere. In fact, we may even get stronger and potentially put troops on the ground or something. But let's not be serious about that. Let's keep it at strategic ambiguity, which then backs them off the responsibility of having said, we're going to put troops on the ground. So they're trying to paint ambiguity to threaten Putin. The problem is Putin's already achieved his maybe not maximal, but his pretty close to maximal objectives. He's got the Donetsk, the Luhansk province. He's got the Crimea, which is his opportunity to move ships into the Black Sea through the Mediterranean out to transatlantic oceans. So right now, he's got what he needs. Holding it is easier than taking it. Taking it, which is what the West would have to do, which is what Ukraine would have to do, is a daunting prospect and one that does not bid well for NATO or the West. So all you're seeing right now is a sort of a last-ditch effort, if you will, for NATO to place what I think is a PR spin on top of this thing, throw some F-16s at it, pretend that we've done our job. probably recognizing that we're at a negotiated settlement, close to it, and they're trying to get the maximum deal at the table possible. This is
so let's go down that path here, because we've now shown the rhetoric, right? That's what the things that have been said. But then here's what the actions are on top of that. So first of all, not many people in the West are even aware of this, because everybody's focused on what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. They haven't noticed what's also happening on the ground in Western Europe, in the NATO countries, as our NATO ambassador brought to our attention.
It's actually 90,000 NATO troops exercising together to prepare for various contingencies, most notably to prepare for any sort of Russian incursion on NATO territory. NATO allies have come together to reinforce and fortify the eastern flank. We're moving troops to the eastern flank. We're enhancing our deterrence and defense and sending a very strong signal to Russia that he should never consider touching NATO territory.
Very strong signal to Russia that he should not do this, because he's definitely thinking about it. He would love to just leap it. Oh, hang on a second. He doesn't really want to go into a 32-member alliance. But anyway, we'll just not worry about that. Even though there's no threat of that, we're going to boot that up. But that's what Russia's seeing. They're seeing your actions, your verbs. And now that here's some actions on our border, again, close to us. And now then, speaking of F-16s,
despite harsh weather, time shortage, and the pressure to return to the fight, Ukrainian pilots and technicians are going through intense training at the Skrydstrup base in Denmark.
Well, combat experience is a thing that is really hard to overestimate, but still it is a really condensed program. I think the biggest boost here is not that combat experience, but the motivation to go back and keep fighting. It is really a super fun jet to fly. I'm not saying that MiG that I flew before is super boring, but the F-16 is definitely more agile. It feels like the jet wants you to fly it more aggressively.
So, yeah, we'd love to fly jets more aggressively. So the Putin sees, all right, first of all, here's your rhetoric. Here's your forces now, large numbers close to my border. Now your airplanes, your jets are about to enter the fight here. And then to sort of underscore that, Vladimir Putin again sends his own message. Because like you said, a lot of this stuff is on the information level. So Vladimir Putin gets on board one of their supersonic nuclear bombers. I believe it's on the same day that the ambassador made that comment about the operations that are going on, the exercises. And so he flew all over these areas where he's kind of pulling his George Bush and his famous landing on the aircraft carrier. Not sure if that's what he was shooting for, but he's trying to look tough, I'm sure. But the point being that he's getting in this nuclear bomber and he's flying around areas where he would loose them in the event that we actually go into a nuclear war, to send a message of his own. Again, you just have to say, okay, the actual war going down on the ground here is in its death throes. Right. Ukraine is not going to win this war. We can talk more about that in just a second. But that should be winding down. We should be doing everything we can to cut bait there and say, all right, this was a disaster. It didn't end well. Russia's not coming into NATO. They don't have the capacity to do it. Even if Putin secretly had a passion to desire to seize all of Western Europe, he doesn't have the capacity. He can't do it. We have nuclear weapons and deter him just like he does. So he knows that. He's not going to commit suicide. But by doing these kinds of things and pushing the envelope closer and closer to Russia, making these provocative statements backed up with some more actions that play to Russia's fears, I can't think this is a good thing for the West.
No, not by a long shot. This is a bit of, again, gamesmanship, bluff, double bluff, and triple blind bluff. When NATO goes out and signals a strong message to Russia, really, in reality, they're signaling a strong message to the West. Get the checks rolling. Let's get Ukraine everything we can. Make sure that the congressmen and senators know that if they don't cut these checks, there's going to be a massive war, and then we're all in it for in for a penny, in for a pound, so to speak. So the idea is, let's get some more money flowing now, so that by the time we wind down the negotiations, we've got a position of advantage. Then, Putin jumps into a nuclear jet and says, "Okay, bluff, let me get your bluff with my bluff. If you want to go that direction, I've got nukes. I've got the second largest nuclear arsenal in the world. So if you want to go there, let's go there." And both of them then kind of meet in the middle somewhere. But here comes the sadness of this consequence. Americans should remember this as we're getting ready to inspire our congressmen or senators to write more checks. we talked about the great game taking place in a field that didn't necessarily matter to the empires. And the point here is the West and NATO are in a place where they're using the Ukrainian lifeblood, the men and the women of Ukraine, the territories of Ukraine, to play this brinksmanship with Russia, the state of Russia, who has at stake their front doorstep, which is Ukraine, their land bridge to the waterways of the South, which means they don't have to drive to the North Atlantic. So it's very important for Russia. It's not very important for the West. And meanwhile, we're exhausting the resources of Ukraine while we're doing this. So before we get too animated, too inspired to crush and go and build and put troops on the ground, we should think very carefully, first and foremost, about our evidence of the last 2 decades of how the United States leadership lies into these positions of maximal resources for absolutely minimal, if any, gains whatsoever.
Yeah.
Don't get fooled a third time. If you're out there hearing this, if you listen to them in Iraq, okay, fool me once. If you got fooled again in Afghanistan, all right, maybe fool me twice. Don't get fooled again in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And the boss, same as the old boss.
That's incumbent upon us, the people who were talking about this, upon our viewers here that we are so grateful that we have. But it's not going to be because of any lack of effort by the America's leaders in particular. They're not giving up on this absurd game that you just so aptly described here. And let's take a look at that now. I said we would look back at what's actually happening on the ground in Ukraine. Let's take a look at that. So first of all, I want to show a clip of Zelensky who's saying, look, we're fighting hard in this, but basically it's up to America if we succeed or not.
You're basically saying that there will be no new success for Ukraine if there's no new U.S. aid. Essentially, this all depends on U.S. aid.
Steps, success forward will depend on USA. Yes. Not defending line, not only defending line. Because if you just defend, you give possibility Russia, push you. Yes, small steps back, but anyway, we will have these steps back.
And then he was asked about the losses, and you probably have already seen this absurdly small number he cites here, but he does at least touch on what you said about the cost to the Ukrainian side.
31 тисяча українців загинуло, військових загинуло в цій війні. Ні 300 тисяч, ні 150 тисяч, що там бреше Путін за своїм брехливим колом. Але тим не менш, кожна ця втрата, росіяни загинуло їх 180 тисяч. Всього втрат загиблих і поранених в Росії до 500 в сумі з пораненими. Я не скажу, скільки поранених, тому що Росія буде знати, скільки людей пішло з поля бою.
Just on the surface of it, it's just kind of, I would say funny, if not for the deathly seriousness of the situation, but to claim in public that after 2 years of war, your side's only suffered 31,000 losses, and then you say, but because of the lies of the Russians that we've lost up to 300,000, but the truth is that the Russians have lost up to 500,000, the side with sometimes 10-to-1 firepower advantage in the air, advantage in the air defense, advantage in artillery, advantage in every category you want to talk about, has an inverse almost 10-to-1 loss in manpower in casualties. It just defies any logic.
Well, the great statement here is the first casualty of war is truth, and so we lost the truth when the first shots were fired. It's not going to be something we'll know for a while. But the point is, remember, Americans lost somewhere around 7,000 to 8,000 troops between Afghanistan and Iraq. And that's devastating in a way, especially when it's every day on the news, what you're seeing. We know the cost and the toll that we have to pay, but don't forget the long-term costs and consequences of injured soldiers, mortal injury, PTSD, suicide, alcoholism. Those ripped through a country for years. Don't forget, after the Civil War, we had the whole abolition movement as a response to how many of our soldiers were drunk in their lives because of what they had to do in the horrors of war. So war doesn't end when the shots stop being fired. War ends, a generation or two after the conflict ceases. So what's at risk here is Ukraine's future. And whether it's 30,000, 300,000, or 500,000, thinking of that compared to the toll we paid for 7,000, 8,000, or on 9/11, the 5,000 or so that died in those tragic consequences. We know how painful this has got to be for a society that only has like 43 million people. We have about 330 million. So this for Ukraine is devastating no matter how we stack it up, which is why wise persons in the West who have a heart for the people on the ground, if you really have a heart for the Ukrainian people, Americans love to talk about that empathy. If you're really empathetic or compassionate, we should be pushing, using our money, using our leverage, using our diplomacy to negotiate the settlement that is reasonable, feasible, and achievable. Not the one that's utopian. The utopian one's not going to happen.
Exactly. Yeah. And what you just said there, again, I could not have said it better myself. You captured both sides, what we ought to do and what we shouldn't do. And now then we find out that our government is still on the utopian side of what we shouldn't do. And I'm going to let them speak for themselves. First, we have National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan a couple of days ago saying this.
Of course, Ukraine can win. Of course, Ukraine has already succeeded militarily in one of the most profound objectives it had, which was to keep the country from falling into Russian hands. It has already done that. And Ukraine can go further in retaking territory that Russia has occupied, but it can only do so if it has the tools that it needs. And that is why the United States needs to deliver the aid package that passed on a massive bipartisan vote in the Senate. The House needs to step up and pass that bill.
Okay, I'm going to circle back to this in just a second about the premise behind his statement that all we need now is to just loose that $60 billion and bam, things are going to radically change on the battlefield. That's his premise. But I got a couple things to show you first. Now then, let's go to what the president of the United States, in a similar way, adds his 2 cents.
We have to stand up to Putin and pass the national bipartisan bill, the National Security Bill, supporting Ukraine as they defend themselves against Putin's vicious onslaught. And prove to the world once more, America can be relied on. We stand strong with our allies. We have to remember who we are. We're the United States of America. We keep our commitments. We never walk away from our friends. And we sure as hell don't bow down to Vladimir Putin.
So, if we got to risk nuclear war because we don't want to bow down to Putin, I guess that's a small price. Yeah. Anyway, last one here, because this kind of put the bow on all of it here. I believe this was this past weekend. You had Ann Applebaum, who's very well known as being a big hawkster, but kind of speaks for that whole class of people. And when she claims that if we do what you suggested just a second ago of doing what's rational and feasible and have a negotiated settlement to get this off the table at the least cost, she says anything less than Biden's category that we should win will result in this dire outcome.
Defeat means the elimination of the U.S. as the security guarantor for Europe. It means that the U.S. is no longer seen as a reliable ally by anybody, by Europe, by Taiwan, by South Korea. It means that not just the Russians, but the Iranians are emboldened, the Chinese are emboldened, all the North Koreans are emboldened, which has already happened. It means, a real transformation in how people view the U.S. in the world, and that would have enormous security as well as economic implications.
Okay, so first of all, point of correction, Ukraine is not an ally. So we don't have a commitment to defend Ukraine. She's describing what would happen if there was like an Article 5 situation where a NATO ally was attacked, and then we said, yeah, you know what, not so much. We're not going to do anything. So maybe some of those things would be true there. So that's the first point there. The second thing is, I think the opposite, I'm convinced certainly the opposite would happen, because it would be foolhardy to the highest degree to not recognize with something when it's not going to succeed, and instead to keep fiction going on and to keep pouring more and more resources into something that cannot succeed. Because here's the thing, Jason, we spent in the first 18 months or so of this war, combined with Western Europe, somewhere around $200 billion, maybe a little bit more than that, depending on how the different categories are added up there. Thousands upon thousands of combat vehicles, many of them the top of the line that various countries had, millions of rounds of ammunition, actually hundreds of millions of rounds, millions of artillery shells, rockets, mortars, all kinds of other ammunition. When Ukraine had, over a half year to prepare for an offensive, they didn't dent the line. Now then, even those dents have been smoothed out, and Russia's starting to move back across the West. By what rationale? I'm asking you an unanswerable question, but I still want you to answer it. Can you say that after all of that we gave for 18 months, all the preparation time in the world, they didn't do anything. They now suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties. And now you want to claim that 60 billion is going to somehow make a difference when 200 billion didn't, after you've added a couple 100,000 casualties on top of that. Make that make sense for me.
I mean, don't miss the point here, Colonel Davis. And don't be small. Open up your checkbook. All it takes is one more stroke of the pen, and we're going to keep coming back to you until we win this thing. Because as Jake Sullivan said, and Ann Applebaum and the president all emphasized, it's not a question of how much, it's we can. And the way we can is by continually going back to the American people, asking for their tax dollars to pour them into this fight. On the technical premise, Jake's right. Ukraine could win this feasibly, just like my neighborhood Little League team could probably beat the New York Yankees given the right conditions. But what are those conditions? And that's what they're not talking about. The devil's in the details. So in some feasible world, if NATO were all in and we gave everything we had and we really loved this, there's a way we could eke out this victory. The problem is those conditions are going to be very difficult to meet. And on the way to meeting them, they're just ringing up the checks over and over again. This is like sitting at a used car sales lot, and someone is telling you by threat, if you don't buy this, if you don't buy my logic, things are going to fall apart for you. It's going to be a disaster. Maybe your doctor, buy this or else.
Yeah,
and then,
but Jason, I got to add one more to that. Here's the perverse of all of that. Even if your Little League beating the New York Yankees thing played out, and in certain series it is possible, theoretically anyway, but even in your theoretic outfit, if that started to happen, as Putin said in that 2022 deal, and he still means as emphatically today, if you started to do that and physically drove Russia out and they were literally starting to lose, they will pull out the nuclear weapons. That's not an empty threat. He would be driven from power by his own people if he had nuclear weapons, and especially tactical nukes, allowed his forces to be driven from the field by a cumulative NATO and didn't use them. He would never do that. So to succeed in the Little League deal would still be catastrophic. Ergo, no way does this end in success for America, period.
Well, and to take it off Putin's shoulders, we don't even have to use him. We can use our own logic to get to that point, right? By our logic, the Ukraine proposition, them winning back Crimea or whatever, is somehow an existential threat to the United States, to democracy worldwide, to all of our security agreements. So if that's that important to us, imagine how much more important it is to Russia. And the point is, if the U.S. is in the pretense of saying all in for this, otherwise the whole world falls apart, then you can imagine what the Russians are feeling. Like it's even more critical to them. So go by the logic of our own statesmen and recognize the technique that's being used here is provocation with threat. The provoking is, what if we lose this war? Then the threat is, well, if we do, this goes away, this goes away. You can't get peanut butter and jelly anymore. You'll all be poor and starved. So in other words, just let us write the checks. Now, keep in mind, we're in an election cycle year. So our statesmen need to get elected. They need to put some wins on the board. And even looking like a perception win sometimes is enough to eke it out at the polls, the national polls. Biden's coming off, the Biden administration, a number of things that a lot of critics might consider failures. People might look at the Afghanistan withdrawal or generally the types of malaise throughout the world. And that for that reason, it's even more important or critical for the administration to gain what our perception wins. If that means dropping F-16s from Danish people to the Ukrainian people, maybe they can go to the polls and say, see here, we did this, and then hand it back over to Zelensky. But your point earlier was sharp. Zelensky's already sort of admitted tacitly that they can't win this, that if they were to win it, it would require all of NATO's assets and tools to do it. He's talking about we can defend this, maybe, but even our defensive line is going to get pushed back by Russia. He's talking about the Dnieper River and how the Russians on the east side of that river, if they want, can progressively over the next 10, 15, 14 years, whatever, 20 years, they can slowly push and incur on those provinces in the west. So what Zelensky was asking for there was a sort of a tantamount security agreement, a security agreement from the West, from NATO, from the United States to a country that's on the doorsteps of Russia. Just to put that in perspective, that would be like Russia guaranteeing a security agreement with Mexico. They're our border ally, they're our border country. So for them to threaten us in that way, it feels like what Russia's going through when we begin to threaten Russia in the same manner, but in reverse. So that's the logic. All you have to do is listen to our statesmen, understand the technique that's happening here.
Yeah, it is, and that's that kind of thinking just doesn't seem to occur in here. But I'll tell you, I have an opinion and a view that if Biden and the Democrats actually are saying, okay, we need some perception wins, let's just drag this out through at least November, then we can deal with it on the other side. I think there's a very realistic possibility that that's part of what they're doing, because if they do some of the things that I suggest here now, which is making a negotiated settlement now, for sure, the Republicans would leap all over it as an act of weakness. And certainly there's be many that would buy that argument. They would say, okay, yeah, see, you failed, and it would be considered a political loser. So the thought would be, let's drag it out past the election, just kind of keep the status quo going, and then everything will be fine. But here's the problem. Just like what happened in Afghanistan, at some point the rot became so great, and the weakness in the forces became so great, and the pressure from the Taliban added on top of it, that finally both the government and the military cracked and collapsed. I believe that there is a greater chance of that happening with the Ukrainian military over the next several months, into the summer, perhaps even, than there is that they get all the way through to the other side of the election here, because the Russians do view this as an existential threat for the very reasons that you mentioned. And I think that, and I'm not saying this is going to happen. This is not a prediction, because there's too many factors I don't have knowledge about on both sides of the line. But just looking at it from an analytical perspective of the things we can see, the chances are higher that happens than that they get through the election with nothing bad happening, in my view. How do you see that?
Colonel Davis, that is why you get paid the big money. That's sharp analysis that I think a lot of people ought to take into consideration. Is what is the state of affairs for the Ukrainian military? Let's take the Russian military, set it aside for a minute, because they got their own problems. The Ukrainian military doesn't have the history of the NCO Corps and leadership, and the battalions are fractured and factionalized, such that Zelensky in the beginning of this was doling out money to his preferred generals below him, which is causing sort of nepotistic clique-like mafioso type structures within the military. Don't be fooled. This is not a congealed, coherent military that has had a long-standing sort of disciplined background. So what you're pointing to is that when you have a military that's kind of training and becoming professionalized while in the middle of a conflict, the likelihood of sustaining professional growth, discipline, and becoming even more improved is not high, unless you have some way to sort of really take time aside to professionalize that. We went through that in our own Revolutionary War when George Washington stood up what was a very undisciplined army, had to bring the Prussians over to help train us. But along the way, there was a lot of slop to that. So again, just like our military, we had to fight from spirit, from tactics that we were adopting at the time. So there is some possibility of it, but it also required tremendous support from the French. So the point here is that analysis you just gave us shows that there is a weakness below the level that most people can see here that goes to the discipline and the heart of how a military engages in combat. Number one, for defensive operations, but more difficult, number two, for offensive operations. That's what we're talking about from now on, is what would it take for Ukraine to be in the offensive win? And that is extremely difficult. And I'll point out one more thing. I saw the comment fly earlier from one of our guests there talking about the Constitution and the American will, and rightly pointing out that a lot of these things are surpassing the will of the American people. And one of our arguments all along the way, and you've been so strong about this, Danny, is getting this type of policy or this type of decision-making back to the body that is responsible for making war is important. And Congress has shirked a lot of that responsibility. They sort of dodged it using kind of tools of statecraft. The president has dodged it. So the point that I think the audience might really resonate with is our politicians are there on our behest, and they serve the Constitution. They don't serve the Poles. They don't serve their whims. They don't serve Zelensky, and they don't serve NATO. They serve us. But to make that impact evident to the politicians, we have to play the same game they're playing with us. We have to threaten them. In other words, the threat that the American people have to give to the politicians is, if you don't start listening to the people, you're out of office. And we have the levers of our ballot box to do that. That happens in November. So if you're not happy with what's happening on the ground, or if you think this is a quagmire, or you got lied to in Iraq, got lied to in Afghanistan, there is one tool you have, or we have, compounded with layers of tools. You can call your senators, you can call your congressmen, you can write them letters, and really talk about the transparency, the accountability. What did we get? We just saw the OIG report released several weeks ago. I'm writing an op-ed about that hopefully will be released soon, talking about how we have admitted that a lot of this money that we're spending on these weapons cannot be tracked once it hits the ground. What that means to the American people is very technically sophisticated weapons are going into the hands of God knows what, and they'll be on the black market for the next 20 years. So the CIA is going to have to send case officers all out throughout the world to go buy these things back. The point is, we can ask for responsibility, we can ask for accountability, but to do that, the American people are going to have to make their voices heard.
Yep. And we're going to get that chance. And I would love nothing better for our politicians to say, you know what, out of self-interest, I recognize that's coming. So we're going to do something that makes sense. I'm just not going to hold my breath, but we'll leave it there for now and continue to have you back. Jason, thanks for these great comments. You really had some gems out there today. Really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me. And we'll see you next time, girl.
We will. We'll see you back very soon, I'm sure. And we value you guys coming. We ask you to like and subscribe and to share this with your friends because folks are like what Jason just had here. It's just stuff you just don't get other places. And we're going to continue to give you the truth that you need to make sense out of what's really going on because we're unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you what you need. Join us later this afternoon at 3 o'clock. We're going to have Tony Schaefer back on again, talking about you may have seen some revelations in the New York Times here recently with the CIA spy war that's been secretly going on in your name without your knowledge in Ukraine, which has implications for our national security. And we're going to have no one better than Tony Schaefer to unpack that. Also, tomorrow we're going to have Doug McGregor back, and you always want to listen to him because he's always got something interesting to say. So we will see you next time on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.